So the board had previously allocated $150,000 from fund balance to perform a study regarding the operations of our emergency communications center and to look at consolidation. And that's kind of as far as we've gone. As far as we knew, that was moving forward, but the county administrator brought to our attention that there may be some concerns with that. So I think tonight's discussion is to try to sort of get through a little bit of that, take a little bit closer look into why we might want to do the study, what the concerns are, and then ultimately it's up to the board whether we continue with the study or not. So I don't know if Mr. Hemstreet or Caleb, if you want to introduce the item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The item before the committee tonight contains an overview of the current public safety dispatch services that are provided by the Department of Fire and Rescue, the Sheriff's Office, and Animal Services. It also contains a little bit of history and the prior rationale for the proposed Emergency Communications Center Consolidation Study. As Mr. Letourneau mentioned, the board did fund $150,000 as part of the fund balance process in January to conduct this study. In the issues section of the item is really where we currently stand with this study, and due to lack of agreement among the critical partners for this study, staff's recommendation is to cancel the study. We do have representatives available from the affected departments. Mr. Letourneau, you've called down to the table, and we would be happy to answer any questions you have about items in this staff report.
Let's just start with, from a process standpoint, initially somebody calls 911, the call comes in, and it is first a fire rescue dispatcher that takes that initial call?
That is correct. The Fire and Rescue Department is the public safety answering point. They answer 911 calls and then route them appropriately from there. And
then they get routed either to a sheriff's office dispatcher if it's a law enforcement call, and about 189,000 of those calls were routed that direction. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Of which 35,000 were emergency, 154,000 non-emergency.
There is a difference between the calls that are routed through the 911 system and calls that are made to the non-emergency line.
So the non-emergency calls are not coming in through fire rescue. They're going directly to a fire rescue dispatch. I mean, yes. A sheriff's office dispatch.
Yes.
Okay. If they're fire rescue, they're getting routed to a fire rescue dispatcher, of which 29,000, if I'm looking at this right,
yes,
were sent that direction. And then what about animal services? 21,000.
That number reflected for animal services is actually the calls we receive ourselves. We have a separate non-emergency line, so those are the calls that come directly to our department.
Okay. Do we have any idea how many come in through a 911?
We do not.
Okay. So some of them do. So those are the three entities that we have. And I think what we're trying to do is look and see if there's a way to consolidate that in any way. So why don't we just kind of go down the row a little bit here and just get the individual perspectives. Chief Brower, did you want to add something initially?
Just that on the receipt of a 911 call, there's a subtle difference than was explained. When a 911 call is received, the fire and rescue dispatchers, call takers answer that call. If it is a fire rescue call, that call taker stays on that and stays on with the caller while it is simultaneously shipped to a dispatcher for loading in the CAD. If it is a police call, then we break contact, we transfer that to the sheriff's office. So there's a slight difference with a fire rescue call being held. The call is held and the processing starts a little bit earlier. So that brought in the notion years ago of common call takers where we wouldn't have to break contact with the caller necessarily from the initial contact. It's routed in just a matter of seconds. It's picked up, but there is a subtle difference in the way the call is processed.
What happens if it's both? Because there are some incidents where it's both.
It can depend. If it is a auto accident, that call is shipped, information is taken, that call is shipped because both agencies are involved. There have been instances where calls have seemingly been a sheriff's department call, like a domestic, but then it may have involved other things that would have kicked it back to fire and rescue. It just depends. If a domestic is indicated by routing to the sheriff's, and then they say they're going to set the house on fire, well, that might need to come back to fire and rescue to get the fire marshal's office involved, so it can work both ways.
Why don't we just start with you, since you're already talking? We'll go from you over. So, do you believe this is something the board should pursue?
The basis of this started a number of years ago when we began planning for the new ECC and the new CAD system. And at the time, we were looking at upgrading equipment, but also developing those best practices that were within the region, that were suitable for growing jurisdictions. There is no one model out there. The intent was clearly to do a study to see if there were more effectiveness measures that could be added to process. Obviously, the county's population is going to drive more activity in the call center, in the 911 center. And so, knowing this is ahead of us, we talked about doing this study a number of years ago. And so the rationale that was provided last year, we thought was sound, which resulted in the board appropriating the $150,000. So I guess from my perspective, you don't know what you don't know. So you have a study.
The complexity of the calls that stay with fire rescue and the average length of time, do you know, can you speak to that? Do you know what it is?
Chief Parker is here if he wants to swing down and talk actual numbers. The complexity of the call is that the vast majority of our calls are ongoing. They're in progress.
Thank you.
I'll let Chief Parker talk about the time frames.
Good evening. So to answer your question about the average time that we're with a caller, we break that down into what's called processing. So from the time that a dispatcher or a call taker understands that we have an incident, they initiate an incident, to the time that the dispatcher is actually received the call, to the time that the units are responding. So that's the numbers that I'm going to give you. That's the performance measures that we use. That's what the NFPA standard actually measures. So you're looking at about, for an EMS call, you're looking at about 1 minute and 40 seconds. For a fire call, you're looking at about 47 seconds. The reason is with our EMS, we have an EMD program in place through Dr. Morgan. Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. Our emergency medical director program, which is through Dr. Morgan. So that's a set of protocols that our dispatchers use. They can initiate CPR. So they can talk to the layperson about how to perform CPR, how to open an airway, how to care for somebody that's having a seizure, how to stop bleeding. So they're on the call much longer with a caller while they're interrogating and providing these instructions, while at the same time that call is being shipped through the CAD system to a dispatcher. So when we're dispatching our calls through fire rescue, the call takers are with the callers, but at the same time they're using the integration of the CAD system and the fire side to send it to the dispatcher, while at the same time the call is actually being dispatched and the companies are being alerted. Fire, we don't use the emergency fire dispatch program in the county. At this point, we didn't bring that in with the new CAD system. So we are using basically just call taker information from confirming location, what is happening, anybody trapped, et cetera, et cetera.
But, so then when it goes to the dispatcher is the one who's managing the incident, at
Yes,
least
sir.
on the airwaves? Okay.
Yes, sir.
So that's obviously a lot longer.
Yes, sir. It can be an EMS call as an average of an hour when you talk to the hospital time, dropping a patient off, reloading supplies and back. Fire calls, if it's a simple fire alarm, it could be 5-10 minutes. It could be a structure fire where we're out there all night. We could be on campaign events throughout the evening. So it really varies on the type of incident that we're running.
Okay. Questions for fire rescue? All right.
Well, yeah.
Okay. Chair Randall.
So, help me understand something. So, if a call is made and it goes to a fire and rescue dispatcher, and then if it's assessed that it needs to go over to the sheriff's side, you said that there is contact, there's a contact break while that person is put on hold, and I understand that happens quickly and it goes over. At that time, does the person have to kind of re-explain what's going on, or does the person who is the fire rescue dispatcher explain? So if I call and say, 911 emergency, my boyfriend is beating me up, I'm located, yada, 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 please help. And then you transfer it over. The caller then has to say again,
Yes, ma'am.
my boyfriend is beating me up, I'm located. So that has to happen twice because you transferred the call. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Ms. Stively,
We were just going to.
oh, okay, we're going to stick with, okay, I'll come back to you. All right.
And then we'll open it up.
Yeah, okay. That's all my questions for them right now.
Okay. Fire rescue, Mr. Buffington.
Thank you. So you have your own, so 911 comes to you, but in addition to that, you have your own non-emergency number, and the Loudoun County Sheriff's Department has a non-emergency, and the Animal Services has a non-emergency. So we have 1 911 and 3 non-emergencies. Is that correct?
Plus, so you have 911, you have a series of non-emergency numbers, and then we also have the legacy old precursor 911 numbers that are still used in an emergency situation, can be used in an emergency situation, yes.
Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else for fire rescue? So let's move on. Welcome, Sheriff Chapman. Thank you for being here. So I know that things are different on your side. Do you want to just walk us through how it works on your side?
Sure. When I first heard about this several years ago, I actually thought it was a good idea because my understanding of it was that we were going to be able to share, our dispatchers would share calls. And we have a very high volume of calls. And if you look at the notes there, when you look at CAD calls for service, last year we were in an area of 253,000 versus about 29,000 for fire and rescue.
But does that include the non-emergency calls?
It does, yes.
So I think what we're talking about here, that would only be the emergency calls, right?
The 29,000 for us is our number of actual dispatched incidents. There
Okay.
are 200,000 plus, I don't have the figure in front of me, in 911 calls that we answer.
I'm just trying to make sure we're using the same numbers when we're comparing.
Right. These would all be dispatched incidents as well. So when you look at that, I thought when I first heard about this would be great because we'd have one pool of dispatchers that could answer things across the board. I've since found out that that's not the case, and I had a lieutenant colonel who's no longer working with us who had never filled me in on where this process was going. I had no idea since I had a conversation about 3 years ago or maybe longer where this was in the pipeline. And then I was kind of surprised to hear that a study was being done on this, and nobody had told me anything in the past 3 years about it. So my concerns are that, first of all, it doesn't really help us in any way because we're still going to have a separation between calls handled by fire and rescue and those handled by law enforcement. So there's really no collective advantage for us when it comes to that. There's nothing that's going to offset that volume of calls. The other problem that I have is accountability. From the time that a call is received till the time that it's resolved, it falls 100% on our shoulders. My concern is by having a third party that's actually in charge of handling all calls for service, whether it's fire and rescue, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's animal services, where we don't have accountability from the start. And I had an incident recently where there was some problems with the way calls were handled by dispatch, where there was some collusion between somebody on the road and dispatch, in which they were trying to delay taking a traffic accident report in hopes that state police would show up. And when I found out about it, we investigated it, and it was really my responsibility to make sure that the folks there understood what their responsibilities were and were appropriately, whether admonished or disciplined for what they had done in that particular incident. So in other words, we lose the accountability. I might be one of several members as part of the board, but the overall accountability would not necessarily fall under the sheriff's office for the work that dispatchers are doing there. Next thing is that we're a constitutional office, and we're, as a sheriff, I'm a constitutionally elected sheriff, we're not a police department, we're a sheriff's office, and we answer, even though we work closely, very closely with the county and with the Board of Supervisors, we're not like most of the agencies that are quoted in the study that was done where they're police departments. And I was just looking at the study here as to who had standalone dispatchers and who was driving their own dispatch. And basically the standalone dispatchers, where you've got the collective agencies working together, are mostly police departments. There are a couple sheriff's offices, but the sheriff's offices are very small. You have one with a population of 77,000 and the largest being a population of 99,000. They're not nearly where we are at 400,000 when you look at the overall population and what we have. And then finally, I would say that our dispatchers identify being employees of the sheriff's office. They identify as being sheriff's office employees. My concern is that you take that identity away, they fall into a larger pool of people that are handling calls just across the board. And what it does is, I feel in a way, for us, it sort of abdicates our control or accountability over the folks that are responsible for handling these calls, and that's my concern. And then finally, I would say that if there were a problem, we'd know about it, we'd address it. I don't know that there is a problem. So although I'm certainly in favor of doing anything that adds efficiency and betters the service for the county and all that, I don't know, number one, that there is a problem, and number two, that spending $150,000 would be money that's well spent on a problem that, as far as I know, doesn't even really exist.
Well, okay. I think we're trying to determine if there is a better model than the one we have, and I'm not sure that we know the answer. But your concerns strike me as more concerns about an outcome if the board were to decide to move to a particular model. But tonight, we're only looking at whether to study it. So a component of the study, which I think would apply regardless of what model we go to, is what the staffing allocation analysis would be. And I think that's whether it's sheriff's employees or county employees, what the pay classification should be, what the shifts should be, all those sorts of things, which I would think would be a benefit for everybody to understand, because ultimately it comes out of your budget, which comes from us. So I guess what I'm having trouble with maybe is understanding what your concerns are, but wouldn't you benefit from that component of the study and then from participating in the study so that we can flesh out what those concerns are and see if there is a model other than what we're looking at that might address those?
I'm not against the study. My thoughts were I felt I found out about this really kind of late in the game, and my concerns were like, well, I don't even know that one needs to be done. If you feel compelled that you want to do a study to determine things, that's fine. I'm just saying that there were issues that came up that were never even discussed with me, and that's what I'm sharing with you right now.
No, I appreciate that. Okay. Other questions for Sheriff Chapman and the Sheriff's Office? Mr. Saints.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the example that you gave, Sheriff, about the recent situation. But from my understanding, if we were to do the study and then go to different models, there would possibly be like a SME, a subject matter expert for each area, would still be in the, bullpen or whatever you want to call it in the department there to oversee, tactical, details, and if there's a major type of event to walk people through the processes, and et cetera. So I think the situation that you brought up is maybe, I don't know if it's a one-off or not, but maybe it doesn't really apply to what we're trying to do here, I guess, with the study is my thinking on it. So any thoughts on that
No, I think the point of that, that example was to just show that there's direct accountability, and my concern is whether or not a study, if all that will be taken into consideration, and hopefully that it would, but it's my concern that if you went to an overall model, that doesn't have that direct accountability, that could be damaging to us as the sheriff's office. But that was just an example of how important it is to have direct accountability from the start of a call to the resolution of that call.
Okay, but again, I think that's we did the study of how you help us to weed out all those things. So in your opinion, you feel that, you say if we did the study and didn't do anything with it, you wouldn't feel comfortable doing it?
No, I mean, if, like I said, if you as the board want to do a study and want to dedicate that, that money to a study, I'm fine with that. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. I just wanted to make sure that you were aware of my concerns that I don't know that ever came up in any discussions prior to tonight with regards to, other than just with Mr. Hemstreet, a couple weeks ago. I don't know that they'd ever come up, and I wanted to make sure that you were aware of those before you embarked on a study to see whether or not you would decide whether a study was still necessary or not.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Buffington.
Thank you, Mr. Letourneau. The first time I became aware of the idea of a study was last year when Animal Services was asking for a new dispatcher, and I had heard that there was a study out there being considered, and I said, why would we approve a new dispatcher for one of these services when we're looking at doing a study? And I recalled we had that conversation, and you were supportive of that time. And I know you said you're supportive of the study itself, maybe not the outcome, but at least the study here tonight again. So that validates my recollection at least. But my thought of the study is not to say there's a problem, let's look at it because there's a problem. It's just, we're a growing county. Are there efficiencies that could be found? And I'm sure if we take the time to study that, there's probably something. I mean, I've heard a couple of examples within the last several months where, without going into the examples, something could have been handled better than it was. And not to blame any of the three agencies, but something could have been handled better than it was. So I don't think we're looking at this as a way to point fingers at anybody or take anything away from anybody. It's just to see, is there a better way to do this? And so unless I hear a compelling reason why we shouldn't at least look into, is there a better way to do this, then I'll be supportive of the study. But I appreciate your input, Sheriff. Thank you.
Okay. Questions for the Sheriff's Office? Chair Randall.
Thank you for being here. So I'm a little confused because I don't know that I actually heard the answer to Mr. Letourneau's question when you talked about the numbers of calls you get, and he said some of those are non-emergency numbers. Can you break out the non-emergency numbers to the calls that comes to the 911?
Yes, we have the, I guess the calls that are dispatched. Would that come up? Okay, so.
For incoming phone calls, we had 189,768. Those are just to the Emergency Communication Center. 35,355 emergency and 154,413 non-emergency.
So many, many more non-emergency than emergency.
Correct.
Okay. Sheriff, you said that you didn't see the collective advantage for us, and I'm assuming us means the Sheriff's Department, correct?
My concern was with the volume of calls that we receive versus what fire and rescue and others may receive, that we weren't, in other words, I thought the collective advantage when I'd first heard about where this might be going was the fact that we would have, say, for example, just a pool of dispatchers that would be cross-trained and would handle everything collectively, and that would ease a lot of the problems that we have with just with the sheer volume of calls that we receive. And then I've since learned that that's not going to be the case. You'd still have the separation between both entities. So I was kind of like, well, what's the advantage? What's the advantage that we get by pooling, by putting it under one roof?
So I'm not sure that we've said we would have separate entities. I think we would. That's part of what the study's for. I don't know if that's a correct statement that we would still just have one entity. So if that's what you meant by, that's what I was trying to get to. If you meant by collective advantage for us is that it would still be under two entities. We don't know that that's the case, in fact.
That was my understanding in anecdotal conversations, but you're right. If the study would determine that, that's also a very important point. I was under the understanding that you would still have sheriff's office and fire and rescue dispatchers.
Because it's very possible, we just don't know yet, that it can be, the people could be cross-trained, and there could be a person that can do both, and then they could cover shifts and things like that. So that would help. You may not want to talk a whole lot about the fact that all these have happened within police departments, unless you want to make a case for a police department in Loudoun County. So that may not be somewhere you want to go unless you're making that case, because you just kind of made that case, to be quite honest. I think you helped me understand another statement, because I was hearing a little bit of a contradiction when you said that you hadn't heard about this, you hadn't spoken into it, and you're not saying, because I know you've heard about it. You're not saying you hadn't heard about it, because we've been talking about this since I've been on this board, and that's been over a year. Or is what you're saying was, what you're not clear on is whether the people would be cross-trained or not, or whether it be two separate groups of folks? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not clear on that, and I really hadn't been updated until I heard that the study was going to be conducted, and I wasn't sure where we're at.
And would that make a difference to you, knowing that they would be, if it was one group of people that would be cross-trained?
Well, that's something that, I mean, when I first heard that that's where it might go, I thought that would be extremely helpful. That way we lighten the load of one, and, I mean, you kind of spread the load out, and that was kind of what I was hoping for.
Yeah, I also think that's a good idea, because I can tell you, if I'm a person on the phone, and I'm having the worst moment of my life, and I have to repeat the worst moment of my life to two different people when I'm making a phone call, that could be problematic. So thank you for clearing those things up.
Can I clarify one thing also?
Absolutely.
You asked about the incoming calls, but the sheriff mentioned the CAD incidents, which are about 254,000. And a large proportion of our workload is self-initiated, where a deputy may initiate a traffic stop or an arrest. And that's also a very large workload for our dispatchers on the radio and the computer support end. So that also has to be taken into consideration for the workload.
It would be great if we had more people who understood how to take those calls too.
Into, as well as phone calls.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we haven't heard from Ms. Stiley. I'm not sure if you want to jump into this, other than, do you have any thoughts on the study, or would you participate, that kind of thing? I think you would participate.
Yes, I'll keep it pretty brief, because in the grand scheme of things, we're much smaller than everybody else here. Our department receives between 22 and 24,000 calls per year. Just two things that differentiate our dispatchers from the others is that we only receive non-emergency calls, and the calls we receive to our number are also for my entire department. So anytime somebody calls about adoptions or lost pets or dog licenses, those are all fielded by my dispatchers as well. The other differentiating factor is that my dispatchers primarily focus on not sending an officer when possible. So if talking to somebody about, say, there's a fox in the yard, walking somebody through the steps to avoid getting bitten rather than sending an officer to the scene. So there's a couple of things that set us apart. But that said, I would want to make sure that, that however we were to be consolidated, if that were to happen, that it was done wisely. So I'd be with what Chief Brower said, that we don't know what we don't know, and a study would be a great way to make that determination.
Okay, Mr. Bono,
Would you like a motion?
if you want to make one, sir.
I'm going to move that the Finance, Government Operations, and Economic Development Committee recommend that the Board of Supervisors continue with the Emergency Communications Center Consolidation Study.
Second.
Motion is made, seconded by Mr. Sains. Opening, Mr. Bono.
All right. This is a study, and I understand the concern Sheriff Chapman put on the table, but the study's purpose is to address those concerns and sort them out. So if there's a concern about accountability, the study's going to look at the various accountability models that can be done here. And it can give us a lot of answers. There's 20 jurisdictions that we surveyed, and it's in our packet, from around the state. And out of those 20 jurisdictions, 10 of them use a standalone agency for dispatch. A few of them use the Sheriff's Office, a few use police departments, one uses the Office of Emergency Management, and one, I would never recommend this, uses their Department of IT. Go figure. So, from my view, if the study can tell us whether or not we're going to gain efficiencies, if the study can tell us whether or not we're going to reduce dispatch times. If the study can tell us whether we're going to reduce response times, because I don't have to explain my situation twice, and if the study can tell us how we can cross-train our folks so that we get a better utilization out of them, then why wouldn't we want to do the study? And to me, the study is what's going to give us the answers as to what may be the right thing to do. Right now, there's concerns, but I think the study is going to attempt to address those concerns. So to me, it makes a lot of sense. We've already appropriated the money. It's not like we have to come up with new money. And I didn't put an appropriation motion in my motion because I don't feel I need to, because it's already been done. So from my viewpoint, we should just go ahead and do this, take a look at it, and let's get the answers.
Mr. Buffington.
I agree with those comments, and I won't add on to them. I just have one question for staff. I just want to make sure that it hasn't been somehow preordained that we won't have, one of the outcomes could not be cross-trained dispatchers. Couldn't that be one of the outcomes in the recommendations?
Absolutely. There's, you know,
Okay.
the study's going to look at all sorts of models, so there's no predetermined model. that
I
would be-
agree with the sheriff. I definitely see the benefit of having cross-trained dispatchers where they're knowledgeable about whatever call basically comes in. So I just wanted to make sure that that wasn't a concern that we have. Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'll certainly support the motion, but I think it's helpful for us to hear from the sheriff going in what those concerns are, so we're cognizant of them. I think now that's out there, and certainly that will be part of the study that will be done. And I know that part of the goal of the study is to go ahead and get legitimate input, both from the leadership of the departments, the individuals who are actually taking these calls, even the consumers, the citizens out there. So, you know, at this point, we're going to look at it. If this motion passes, we're not making a decision as to what to do, because I don't think we could make that decision right now. We don't know. It may be we leave everything alone. But let's take a look, and let's have a good, just as a best practice. It's been many, many years now. We've grown quite a bit, and then we'll go from there. Any other comments? Chair Randall?
Nope, no, I was going to vote.
All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Motion passes 5-0.